Right, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Vaughan Coops. I'm the Assistant Clerk Committees in the Legislative Assembly. Welcome to day 3 of the ASPG conference. We acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal owners of the land upon which we are meeting. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present and future, and the elders from other communities who may be here today or viewing our proceedings as we go ahead with today's ASPG conference. A little bit of housekeeping once again. Please, if you're not a panelist or not presenting, please leave your microphones muted and cameras off unless you're presenting. We have a chat function and a Q&A function. If you have any questions, please put them in there or wait until the end of the presentations as they run through the day, or use the raise hand function as at the end of each presentation, and the moderators will get to you at that point. Today's presentations are being recorded, so if anyone has any issues or has any questions about that, please contact the Victorian ASPG Secretary, who you will have received invitations from for these sessions. And also a final reminder just to presenters to remember to turn on their cameras and microphones when you are presenting. I will hand it over soon, I guess. So I'm pleased now to hand over to Warwick Gately AM, who's been Victoria's Electoral Commissioner since 2013 and who has very kindly agreed to moderate our next session, which will be about elections. So I will hand it over to Warwick. Welcome, thank you.
Vaughan, many thanks for that introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here, to be asked to moderate a session for the 2022 Australasian Study of Parliament Group Conference. And as you mentioned, Vaughan, this session is about elections. Vaughan mentioned I've had 9 years here in this role in Victoria. Prior to that, I was the Electoral Commissioner in Western Australia for about 10 years. And prior to that, I served for many years in the Royal Australian Navy. I'm joined by the presenters this morning, Dr. Damon Muller, Professor John Phillimore, and perhaps a little later on, Associate Professor Martin Drum. First, we will hear from Damon Muller, a senior researcher at the Australian Parliamentary Library. Prior to joining the Parliamentary Library, Damon was working with the Australian Electoral Commission in their Integrity Unit. And before that, he held roles at the Victorian Department of Health and the Australian Institute of Criminology and the Australian National University. And Damon has a doctorate in criminology from the University of Melbourne. But Damon's going to talk to us about legislative and practice responses to elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will just observe that since 2020, every jurisdiction has held either a parliamentary or a local government round of elections. New Zealand, of course, also held a general election. A significant amount of exchange of information and ideas between the various election administrations over that period of time as we attempted to deliver elections without affecting the franchise, conducting elections with integrity and independence, while at the same time protecting the health of the many participants in the election process. So I look forward to hearing from Damon. And Damon, I might hand over to you now. And when you complete your session, I'll introduce John Phillimore and Martin Drum when we come to the other part of the session. So Damon, over to you, please.
Right, thanks very much, Warwick. I'm very pleased to be here from slightly rainy Canberra, and I would like to also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the particular spot where I am sitting right at the moment. As Warwick mentioned, I'm here to talk to you today about elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to thank you and thank the conference organisers for having me. As Warwick mentioned, most Australians now have some experience of voting during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I counted something like 14 electoral events since the start of 2020 that have been sort of conducted to some extent under the COVID-19 situation. And to an extent, electoral commissions have got pretty good at running elections under COVID-19. That's not to say that it's straightforward, but the practical matters of, especially the ones that voters notice, of social distancing and queuing and basic hygiene measures and pencils, single-use pencils, all those sorts of things are pretty well understood now. And in fact, they're pretty well understood by anyone who's had to go into a bank branch or do any other sort of transaction in person in these situations. So they're relatively straightforward. But I'm going to be talking a bit today about a few different aspects of elections. I'm going to speaking briefly on the effect on campaigning, then a little on the effect of voting methodologies. Should acknowledge that there has been a fair amount written on this topic, although when I was doing some research for it, it seems like there was a whole lot of publications that came out in 2020 and sort of very little since. And since the start of the pandemic, we've got quite a bit more experience, some of it positive, some of it not so positive, in conducting elections under a pandemic. I forwarded a very drafty draft of the paper to the conference organisers. I'm not entirely sure how they've made that available, if they have, but if they have, I encourage you to read it. And having just read through it myself, I encourage you to skip over a couple of typos that I seem to have missed. So first, I'm going to talk a little for a couple of minutes about campaigning under the COVID-19 pandemic situation. One of the things we don't tend to really focus on that much as researchers, but is probably actually pretty important, because elections are a conversation between a number of parties, the voters and the candidates mostly, that's facilitated by the electoral management bodies. And the candidates, as much as those of us in the election game sort of find the elections would be much easier without candidates, they tend to cause much more problems than voters do, for example. The candidates are an important part of the campaign, and we've probably not looked too much at the effect that the pandemic has on campaigning. There have been a few elections where there has been sort of significant restrictions on campaigning, and they seem to be mostly from my research on local government elections. Now, I acknowledge that this part of the paper is probably the least developed, because it's not the area that I have a huge amount of experience in myself, but also it doesn't seem to be somewhere where there's a lot of research. So if anyone has any further information about this, I'm happy to hear about it. From the looking that I've done, it seems that most of the impact on campaigning has been for, as I mentioned, for local government elections, less so for state elections. There were in Victoria, we had a local government election which was entirely postal voting under the pandemic. There's been local government elections in Queensland and New South Wales as well, where there was restrictions on campaigning, such as handing out how to vote cards for social distancing purposes. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the campaigning side of things, other than to note that it is something we probably need to look at in more detail in the future. But also, it's one of those issues where there is some interesting constitutional questions. Obviously, the High Court has said that there is a implied freedom of political communication in the Australian Constitution, but that it's not absolute, and that there are certain permitted restrictions on that freedom of political communication. The High Court's also similarly said that the limits on constitutional freedoms are permitted to some extent due to public health measures. Exactly how those two things interact is yet to be seen, I think. So that will be something that will be interesting to see into the future. All right, I'll move more to move now to a topic that I probably know more about, which is the impact of the pandemic on voting methodologies. And to some extent, one of the themes here is that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the conclusion, is that there really hasn't been a huge amount of innovation during the pandemic, but mostly things that we've tended to do already, we've done a bit more of. And in some cases, the pandemic has shown the limitations of doing more of those things. One of the approaches has been early voting. Early voting is something that Australians have embraced with some enthusiasm over recent elections. It's hard to guess exactly what the rate of early voting will be at the 2022 federal election, but sort of combined postal and in-person early voting might get to 50% this election. That's certainly the direction in which it was going. The pandemic, during the pandemic, early voting has been one of the responses that electoral commissions and legislators have used, primarily in order to allow less crowding on election day, encourage more social distancing, reduce the impact of queuing, those sorts of things, by spreading the crowds out, not just on election day, but over a couple of week period. It's something that political parties and politicians and legislatures have traditionally viewed with less enthusiasm than voters have. From their perspective, it means manning polling booths, handing out how to vote cards for 2 to 3 weeks during an election period rather than just on election day. It means the campaign has to account for the fact that a large number of people might have voted a couple of weeks before polling day. So any new information that you're introducing into the campaign needs to take that into account. But voters generally have been quite enthusiastic about it. Under federal law, Schedule 2 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act lists the reasons, allowable reasons for early voting and for postal voting, and in fact, they're exactly the same. And one of the reasons is not convenient, or it's more convenient, or because I felt like it, but that's why it seems apparent that a lot of voters actually do early vote. The pandemic has definitely, the early voting has been used as one of the features in the pandemic. Sorry, just give us a second. Some of the electoral management bodies around Australia have been quite enthusiastic about early voting and have encouraged people to early vote during the pandemic. This won't be the case in the federal election. There isn't any additional allowances for early voting in the federal election that were not present in previous elections. There was some legislation passed, but they require the an emergency declaration to be in place. The ACT Electoral Commission is actually probably one of my favourite examples of how the Electoral Commission sort of embraced early voting around the pandemic, because they didn't even talk about an early voting period and a polling day. They talked about the voting period, and the voting period ended on a particular day, excuse me, which was polling day. And that's quite a different approach to early voting than traditionally electoral commissions are allowed to take. So in effect, the ACT Electoral Commission seemed to have been able to convince the ACT Assembly to allow the Commission to treat early voting as the voters have treated it, basically. Another approach has been postal voting. Postal voting is a long-time feature of Australian elections. The postal voting has been available during all the pandemic elections to various extents. In some of the elections, most notably in recent New South Wales by-elections, postal votes were sent out to all the voters. This is, in fact, postal ballots were sent out, not just postal vote applications. The postal votes excuse me, the postal vote application process sorry, I'll get there eventually. Postal votes are probably going to be a large feature of the federal election. There's no authorisation under the Federal Electoral Act for postal ballots to be sent out to voters without an application, but the political parties in the Australian federal election have been very enthusiastic about encouraging people to postal vote. The AEC is understandably concerned about the number of postal votes that they'll receive this election. Already extremely high numbers of applications. And one of the problems with high levels of postal votes is they require some additional handling and additional time constraints in order to actually count them. The AEC has been sort of quite strident this election about encouraging actually people to vote in person and not postal vote. And I'll just quickly quote something that the Electoral Commissioner said, that at a estimates hearing, he says, "We're very confident with the postal vote process, but my view is that the Act requires people to vote on the day unless there's a reason for them not to vote. And one of the reasons is the fewer votes in envelopes, the quicker the result will be known, the more likely it is that we'll have a result on the night or close to on the night, depending on how many postal votes there are." So this is sort of the first time in my experience that the Federal Electoral Commissioner has sort of been quite forthcoming about their view that sort of voters should elect not to postal vote if they can. Internet voting has been another one of the processes that has been used during the election, during the pandemic, elections during the pandemic. The prime example is probably the New South Wales local government elections, where the same restrictions on internet voting existed as they have since it was initially introduced, which is essentially similar reasons for postal voting, is in that you can't get to a polling place during election day, for example. The large number of internet ballots they received led the system to basically collapse. A number of people were not able to cast their online vote as they intended, and as a result, a number of the elections during the local government election had to be voided and will be rerun. So obviously there was an enthusiasm by the voters to engage in internet voting, but probably to the extent that the system really wasn't able to cope with. The New South Wales Electoral Commissioner has stated, as a result of this experience, that postal voting won't be available in upcoming New South Wales elections, which is probably a little unfortunate, because it was a useful system for voters who weren't able to actually make it to a polling place or weren't able to have a postal ballot because they don't have a reliable postal system near where they live. But it seems reasonable that the Electoral Commission will sort of go away and examine the failure in a bit more detail before they sort of bring in their new postal internet voting system. Another system that's being used in the current election is phone voting. Phone voting has been available in a couple of the state and territory elections, but it's really the only alternate voting methodology in the federal election for those who are stuck at home because of a COVID infection, particularly after the close of applications for postal ballots, which in federal elections is at 6 p.m. on the Wednesday before polling day. So the AEC has said that this phone voting system exists. It's an adaptation of a system that they've used for blind and low vision voters since 2013, and is currently now available to Antarctic voters as well. The AEC has cautioned that it might not be a smooth process. It's hard to know exactly how many people will be affected by this, but the blind and low vision voting has included a few thousand people for the last couple of elections, and might conceivably be tens of thousands of people in this election. So it remains to be seen exactly how well the phone voting system works, and it seems that the AEC is already sort of setting expectations that maybe it won't be entirely smooth for everyone. I think one of the one of the things when you look at the alternate voting approaches to COVID during the COVID pandemic has been, as I noted earlier, we've really not introduced any new systems. We've taken the systems we currently have and tried to expand them out to more voters. The different systems, some of them have worked well, some of them have not scaled particularly well. I think, there's certainly an argument that can be made that during global pandemic is not the time where we should be bringing in new electoral innovations. The risks are quite high, and even where in systems where electoral commissions have had a pretty good idea what they're doing and how they work and what the limitations are, we're seeing that the systems have sort of been stretched beyond their breaking point. We haven't seen any, with the exception of the local government, a couple of the local government elections, we haven't seen really any major sort of electoral disasters as a result of these measures. We've not had a huge number of really close elections where the number of outstanding postal ballots, for example, has really cast into doubt the results. But I guess we'll see at the federal election where you have sort of a large number of electorates, some of which have been quite close before, and potentially a large number of ballots, and legislative restrictions on, for example, how long you can wait till the ballots have arrived in order to count them. One of the features of the Australian electoral system is that we have very prescriptive legislation for running elections, and the COVID-19 pandemic has caused legislatures to give electoral commissions a little bit more latitude, including largely through legislative instruments that have been enabled through legislation. I hope one of the things that is a hangover from the experiences during these elections is that the electoral commissions have shown that they can really be trusted to have a bit more latitude over how they run elections, and that maybe that having a bit more latitude through legislative instruments as to how elections can be run in the future is something that parliaments might consider. But it'll definitely be interesting to see how these things go into the future, and to what extent trends such as increased early voting or increased postal voting or demand for internet voting really outlast the pandemic in relation to elections and how they run in Australia. And that's it for me, and very happy to answer questions after all the presenters have finished.
Damon, many thanks for that, and very conscious of the time. Look, I'm going to jump straight away to Professor John Phillimore from the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy at Curtin University, and also to follow John, Associate Professor Martin Drum from the University of Notre Dame, Fremantle. I'll provide no more in relation to their introduction. They're probably well known to you. And John, please, could you take the floor, to be followed by Martin? Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. I'm trying to start my video, but here we go. I'm in. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Am I in? Now I'm in. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. From actually a wet Perth today, which is pretty unusual. Martin and I will be, I'll be doing most of the speaking this morning, but Martin will be there to help out when I slip up, which I'm sure I will, and also to help answer the questions. I'll quickly share the screen. Hopefully this all works. I've just got to find my PowerPoint, which is always a tricky thing. Oh, goodness gracious me. Right, hang on. Sorry about this, guys. Just got to find the presentation. If Martin, if you got it there, you might be able to help me. I'll tell you a little bit about the background. Where's my thing gone? Sorry, I thought we didn't have a chance to practice, so I haven't had a chance to actually do this. Here we go. Inbox desktop. That's what I want, and it's desktop. Sorry. There it is. Right. It should be up any second. Just let me know whether you can see that. You can see that, Warwick?
Not yet, John, no.
I can see it on my screen. How about you guys now?
Not yet, John. We can just see the folder at the moment.
No, it might just take a second because it's now come up on mine. So as you are screen sharing, that's what I see. I see the actual presentation.
No, still nothing seen, John.
Do you want me to share it?
Yeah, if you can do it, mate. Sorry.
I just need to stop and then I can start.
Yeah, okay. I'll do it now. Sorry. Stop share. Okay about that. Sorry. Martin's done the presentation for me. I'm usually the host. I don't actually do the present. I don't do the sharing. There you go. Martin's done a great job. Just quick background to this is Martin and I were appointed by the state government last year to be on a ministerial expert committee to look at electoral reform. Martin, can you do that from start as opposed to do it as a slide as opposed to those things down the left-hand side? Perfect, thanks. So as many of you might know, it was looking at the upper house electoral system in Western Australia and looked at two issues. One was equality of votes, the traditional one vote, one value debate, and one was looking at voter preferences, which was basically talking about the role of group voting tickets above the line versus below the line voting. I'm not going to talk about the first issue, the equality. Understandably, a lot of the submissions we got was the most contentious issue. However, and there was not very contentious, the issue of moving towards the Senate type model of allowing people to give preferences above the line. But there were a couple of very strongly worded submissions from very respected people, Malcolm McCarris amongst them, who were arguing very strongly about the relative merits and demerits of allowing inter-party and intra-party preferencing, in particular about how whether or not people should be allowed to vote for a party or should they be voting for individual candidates. And so that got us thinking a little bit. And so Martin and I have come up with this presentation. So that's where we're coming from. Martin, I think you might have to do the pressing of the buttons to get us to the next slide. I will admit that it's a fairly preliminary analysis, so you just need to know that, and we'll be very keen to get questions and have a discussion. So as all of you know, I'm sure, most of our upper houses use what's called proportional representation single transferable vote. So we combine those two, and that's pretty unusual internationally in our upper houses, and that's the situation in the Senate, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and West Australian upper houses. There are, of course, as we know, Hare-Clark proportional systems in Tasmania and the ACT in the lower house, but they don't have the horizontal ballot where you can vote above or below the line. So we've not included them in this analysis, but we're only looking at those other 4 states and the Australian Senate. Next slide. And as we said, some people have been suggested that below the line voting is absolutely essential, so voters can directly elect their candidates of choice. And there are really 2 things we're talking about here. There's inter-party preferencing, where basically candidates decide whether they're going to vote Green, Labor, Liberal, National, or whatever. And then there's intra-party preferencing, in other words, what order they preference their candidates. So they might want to vote for number 4 on the ticket as opposed to number 1. And Malcolm McCarris and others have certainly talked about this. And there's been a lot of discussion as to how you can get this to occur in a system. And so a lot of the movement in the recent past has been about trying to promote the ability of electors to choose inter-party preferencing and to decide where their preferences go for the party. But others have argued very strongly that the most important thing is to be able to vote for an individual and not for the party. Next slide. So really there's 2 forms of above and below the line voting systems in Australia, which many of you would know, what we call Model A and Model B. And Model A is the traditional model, where you just vote 1 above the line and your preferences are then distributed via group voting tickets which have been lodged by the parties or the group who've put the column together. And therefore, if you want to vote for someone other than the order in which the party is, if you want to vote for a party preference other than what the party is lodged, you have to vote below the line. So in Victoria, as many of you would know, the Labor Party will often not, for example, preference the Greens in their lodged preference votes, their group ticket vote. And so therefore, if you want to go, say, Labor 1 and then your next preference to the Greens, then you've probably got to have to vote below the line. Similarly, with the Liberals and Nationals or with other party groupings, they decide where your preferences go. And that's, of course, given rise to the micro-party phenomenon, which we all know about. In Australia, there's 2 variants of this above the line model. In West Australia, up until very recently, until about 3 months ago, we had full preferential. If you wanted to vote below the line, you had to number every square. So if there are 53 candidates, you had to vote 52 times. So we all knew 53 was the 53rd. So therefore, full preferential is what you had to do below the line in Western Australia. That used to be the system everywhere else in Australia, other than Victoria. When Victoria introduced its proportional representation system, it said you only needed to number 1 to 5. They have a regional system with 5 members every region, and they say basically you only have to vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 below the line, and it's a valid vote. So that's optional preferential. But in both those states, until recently in Western Australia, you vote above the line, the party decides where your preferences go. Model B is the one that everyone else has now, where you can vote for more than one box above the line, and that allows you to decide where your party preferences go, where your inter-party preferences go. But if you vote above the line, that means that below the line, you have no choice. The party decides your order of preference below the line. So there's different rules about how many votes below the line is a valid vote. There's also issues to do with savings provisions, etc. But we're not going to go into that. But that's the basic model, which many of you would know. Okay, next one. So what might make below the line voting more likely? It depends a lot on its interaction with above the line voting, unsurprisingly. So if you only really care about your inter-party preferencing, do you want to vote, shooters and fishers followed by the nationals, then a move to Model B is likely to make above the line voting most attractive and will reduce below the line voting. If voting above the line is very easy, people tend to do that and they don't vote below the line. So therefore in Western Australia, for example, we have to fill out every square. Below the line voting is pretty small. In Victoria, as we'll see, where you can vote just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get more people voting below the line. Another factor is that the more columns and candidates on the ballot, then the more likely people are to vote above the line because they just get overwhelmed by all the choice and by the size of the ballot paper. The more preferences you need to vote below the line for a valid vote, of course, the less likely to use it, which is what I was just talking about. And the more preferences that are required, the more likely you get informal votes because people make mistakes. So therefore, clearly the fewer preferences that are required below the line for a valid vote, and this is an important issue which we don't look at too much, but it is talked about in the discussions about whether one should move to this Model B, is more likely you're going to get preferences exhausting. Because basically you only maybe vote for 5, you only express 5 preferences, and therefore your vote will be exhausted after those preferences are counted. So that's an argument maybe not to have a small number of votes below the line. Next. People have looked at this, of course. Anthony Green, we're talking about a person in a minute who's talked about this issue. And they've asked some questions, important questions. So how many below the line preferences voters indicate? If they're told they've got to vote at least 5, do they go on and can fill out the whole ballot paper? Or do they vote 10, maybe 2 groups, etc.? So people have looked at that, and Anthony Green's done that. And again, he's looked at the savings provision idea whereby you're advised to vote 12, at least 12 in the Senate. But I think, as far as I know, if you vote up to 6, that'll still be a valid vote. There's also analysis about, well, who tends to vote above and below the line in terms of parties. And there's also discussion about whether moving from Model A to Model B has indeed reduced the informal vote. The original intention of having Model A, in fact, was to reduce informal voting because it was massive in the Senate. So in 1984, they reduced the informal vote massively, but there's now been, as more and more candidates and parties come up, you get more and more informal voting. So that's another issue. Next. So our questions, as we're now moving pretty much everywhere in Australia from A to B, is, well, what's the impact on taking up below the line options? And given this growing move towards Model B, how many voters are using the below the line option now for intra-party preferencing? Because they can do their inter-party preferencing above the line now. So really, below the line is, if you like, classic STV, single transferable vote for an individual candidate. Are people doing that? So that's what we're hoping to look at. Next. So there are our 3 questions. What have been the trends in below the line voting, pre and post change? How many voters are departing from the intra-party candidate order, and how many are departing from the inter-party preference order in the older system? Now, doing this research is a bit tricky. Of course, we've got the Electoral Commission reports from around the country in terms of voting, and most give pretty detailed information about how different regions and their states vote by group. You can find out whether they've been voted for a ticket or whether they voted below the line for the lead candidate or for other candidates, but it's very hard to then find out where those votes go. So apart from just getting the raw data, we've used a proxy measure below the line voting if you vote for the number one candidate versus whether you vote for the rest of the group. New South Wales tends to produce that information publicly and put it in its reports. I can calculate that if I can see the electoral votes for each region in question. And that our hypothesis is that if you vote for the first candidate below the line, it's very likely you're going to just go down the ticket. In other words, you're not actually changing your intra-party preferencing. So that's our assumption. But how do we test that? It's not very easy. And so luckily, we actually do have ballot paper samples from, there's two examples we've managed to find. Victoria, we'll talk about in a minute, and we've managed to get some data from the Electoral Commission of West Australia. Unfortunately, they're both Model A states, but hopefully down the track, we can do some Model B modelling. Next. So just quickly go through some of the existing jurisdictions that you know of. So there's the Senate, as you can see, they abolished the group voting ticket in 2016, and that led to a big increase actually in below the line voting when they got rid of group voting tickets. So above the line voting, sorry, in 2019 was still 92.7%. So 7% of people only are voting below the line. Most people are voting above the line, and Anthony Green's done a lot of analysis about the Senate. So to go to the next one, Martin, and you can see the big variations across the states. And unsurprisingly, again, the two jurisdictions who've got Hare Clark systems in their state or territory, Tasmania and ACT, many people are very comfortable voting below the line, and you've got 22 and 27% of people voting below the line. The two states who have got the Model A system, whereby above the line it was just a number one, and it was probably a bit of an effort to vote below the line, had the lowest level of below the line voting. That's Victoria and Western Australia. But all states are higher than in 2013. So really we've managed to get rid of that big tablecloth, massive groups, massive number of groups, massive number of candidates, and the micro-party phenomenon as a result in the Senate. Next. If we look at the states, though, New South Wales, of course, was the first one. They had the big tablecloth election, Anthony Green, that famous photo, 1999, and they changed to a Model B system in 2003. And the number of groups dropped dramatically, as you can see there on the right-hand side, that big blue line sort of spike there. And the number of candidates hasn't dropped because in New South Wales, you have to have at least 15 candidates on your list. And in fact, many groups have more. And so therefore, you've still got lots of candidates, and it really is a bit, if you ever look at New South Wales ballot paper, it's a bit of a shock to the system. It's a big wall of names. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see that in New South Wales, below the line voting is really small. It's 2.3%. It's really dropped. People just vote above the line, go tick number one or 1, 2, 3 above the line, and that's it. Less than 1% of all voters select the candidate other than the lead candidate on their party or group list. So most people who do vote below the line just go voting for number one on the top and working their way down. So it's about a third of the below the line voters are voting for other candidates. So that's a reasonably high number, but we've got to remember it's only about 1.5%, 2% of people, absolute tops, are actually voting below the line. So this might reflect this big ballot paper with all those names. Next, South Australia, you have to elect 11 MLCs, and the groups there, you only have 2 to 8 candidates listed, often 6. So it's a much neater ballot paper, especially when they changed in 2018 to Model B, and therefore the number of groups and candidates dropped dramatically, as you can see on that graph there. And as a result, it got much easier to sort of see what you were doing. And so if you go to the next slide, in South Australia, you see that the average below the line voting, it's increased a bit in 2018. In fact, it's doubled, but it's still pretty small. It's only 6%. But basically, because it got cleaned up and people didn't have to do so much below the line, and because it wasn't so sort of confronting, South Australia in 2014 had a whole lot of different levels and layers. It was very confusing. People just voted above the line. Now they've got more chance to vote below the line. It's simpler, but it's still pretty small. And once again, voting for others is pretty small too. People still tend to vote for number one on the ticket. We now move to the Model B states. So you've got WA, I think is next, Martin. As many of you know, we've got a regional system like Victoria until recently, and it was pure Model A, compulsory voting is required below the line. But we had this big jump in candidates in 2017 and 21. We almost doubled the number of candidates. And I think basically what happened was ever since the 2013 federal election, people got got wind of the whole idea of preference whispering and the micro candidate idea, and suddenly big jump in numbers. People got massive ballot papers, even in a region electing only 6 MLCs, and guess what? They all gravitated rapidly to voting above the line because below the line was too complicated. And that's what's happened. So you only got 2.5% of people voting below the line. Next. And in Victoria, something similar happened in terms of they got a big increase in candidates in groups in 2014 after that 2013 federal election. But because Victoria does not make you fill out all the squares below the line, their below the line voting share has increased, which has been which maybe is completely opposite from what's happening in WA. And that's partly because there's been a big public campaign in Victoria. Again, because micro parties got in with almost no vote, a lot more people are now arguing you should be voting below the line. Don't let those parties decide for you what your preference is going to be. So because the parties are determining inter-party preferences in Victoria, if you vote above the line, an increasing number of people are now voting below the line. So in fact, almost 9% at the last election. And there was a move to try and get rid of that, as people in Victoria would know, but it's been ruled out for the next election at the end of this year. Next. So what we wanted to then do was look at, well, what's actually happening when you're voting below the line? What are voters doing? And remarkably, I haven't seen this until very recently. Paul Higgins, and I don't know if people may know Paul, made a submission to the Senate election looking at the 2013 election where the big micro-party issue occurred and people got elected on very small numbers of votes, and they were looking at reform, and he provided a submission to that Senate committee about an analysis he'd done of the 2006 Victorian election when they first moved to PR in the upper house, and looked at what was happening to below the line voting. So he must have got access to all those below the line votes. And he found some of these things here. 5% of people had voted below the line. As we now know, that's now up to 9%. And there is differences between parties. The minor party supporters tend to vote below the line, whereas the two major parties had the lowest below the line votes. And in fact, almost the 28% of below the line voters were Greens. He also noted, and this is the most important points from our point of view, 83% of voters kept within the same group for their first few preferences. And in fact, if you go 2 more dot points down there, 67.89% voted in ballot paper order for their preferred group. So that's basically that sort of is the test, if you like, when we argue that if you vote number 1 at the top of the ticket, we're assuming you're going to keep on going down. But we don't know that. That's our assumption. Paul Higgins has shown that 67% of people, actually, that's what they're doing. They're voting number 1 and just following down the list and keeping the same order of intra-party preferencing. It is lower for Labor and Liberal people, there's no doubt about that, but at least half of them are also just following the ticket. So they're going down, they're basically using that below the line vote, it seems, to maybe move and change their inter-party preference, not their intra-party preference. Next one, Martin. And so what does that say? Firstly, minor parties are making more choices, and that means choices around preferences, both inter and intra. And the Labor and Liberal voters just follow the how to cards and vote above the line. Below the line voters seem to be more informed, and hence they're using that vote correctly, if you like, in inverted commas. They are staying within the same group and their subsequent preferences, though, as we said, and they're still following the ballot order. And so therefore, you do get, if you're going to get a high number of people down below just voting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in Victoria, you're going to get a high rate of exhausted votes. And that may be a problem in some people's eyes. We now look at in West Australia, and we've done some very preliminary analysis. The WA Electoral Commission was very nice and gave us a sample of ballot papers. Obviously, everything's de-identified. And we looked at a particular region in Perth, where overall 2.3% of people voted below the line. And again, as you might expect, minor parties, about 9% of people who voted for minor parties voted below the line, but only 2.2 and 1.5% for Liberal and Labor respectively voted below the line. And in fact, 22% of all the below the line votes were Greens, even though Greens only got 6% in that region. So from that sample, which was reasonably representative, it was a little bit different from the region, as I mentioned there, but 88% of voters kept within the same group. Okay, they would vote. So if you voted Labor, you might vote 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6 for your Labor, six Labor members, etc. But basically 88% of voters kept within the same group for their preferences. And that was much higher for non-major parties, but still very high for the big parties. But this is the key point. 63% of people voting that ballot paper kept the order of their preferred group. So they're still voting in the order. Now, Labor and Liberal, admittedly, that's lower. So therefore, if you don't like what the party bosses have done and you really thought somebody got dropped and shouldn't have been dropped, well, that's a problem. So basically what they did was 43% of people who voted Labor did do a different order. But you've got to remember, only 1.5% of Labor people even voted below the line in the first place. And if you go a bit further down to work out, well, are people agreeing or not agreeing with the party's group voting ticket? This just gives you 2 dot points here. Less than a fifth of below the line Labor voters are following the ballot paper order and then preferencing as Labor did. In that region, Labor actually preferenced the Greens. But only 18% of people who voted Labor below the line went Labor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Greens 7, 8, 9. And only 6% of Greens who actually gave their next preference to the Animal Justice Party followed what they were doing above the line. So in that case, people in WA were using below the line to do different inter-party preferencing more than they were doing it for intra-party preferencing. Okay, we're almost done. So in some of the submissions we received in our expert committee and also just in general commentary, you do get people saying, why do we bother with the below the line? The percentage doing below the line is very small, even after we've shifted to Model B. And it seems that a majority of those who are voting below the line are following the intra-party preferencing order on the ballot paper anyway. And so they're not really using the below the line vote for its intended purpose, which was to try and reorder who you vote for. It does make a very complicated ballot paper by having the names below, if you look at New South Wales and other ballot papers. And so in other words, the proportional representation part is dominating the single transferable vote part of the voting system. And some people argue, why don't we just move to a party list system and be done away with it? You can choose individual candidates to represent you in the lower house, in the upper house. Surely we're just voting for parties and not for individuals. And so you do get people arguing we should just do away with below the line voting. Next. Of course, there's an alternative to that. You know, people wouldn't accept it. They're used to it now, they want the option. And there's also a normative reason, which is your Malcolm McCarris and others arguing. So it's very important that voters be able to express their intra-party preferences and not allow the party bosses to control who gets to choose them, which order they're in. Even if people don't do it that often, they've got the option. And of course, you do get the occasional rebel party candidate who is disgruntled. They've been put number 4 on the ticket and they campaign and say, well, vote me number 1 and then go down the ticket 1. So effectively vote 2, 3, 4, 1, 5, 6. And that's had some mixed success in Australia. But the real reason why it's still there, of course, is constitutional. In the Australian Constitution, Section 7 says that senators must be directly chosen by the people of the state. And that's allowed ticket voting, but as long as the individual are referenced in the ticket. And WA amended its constitution in 1978, which basically says that electors must be chosen directly by the people. And that's been interpreted to mean, hasn't really been tested legally, I don't think, but because there's been no move to shift to direct party voting only, party lists, but it's been interpreted to mean that the option of voting for an individual candidate must be retained. And so therefore, below the line voting, I think we're stuck with it. Anthony Green, I don't think he's very happy about it. He sort of said, well, we've got it, but he'd probably prefer it not happen, but that's the way it is. So final slide, I think, next, Martin, is, so there's some of the influences on the below the line rates that we talked about. But our other conclusion is that Model A systems, the ones that West Australia's just got rid of and that Victoria's still got, does discourage below the line voting and intra-party preferencing, unless you do what Victoria's done, which is to reduce the number of preferences. The problem is if you do that, then you're going to get more people who get votes exhausted. And our early analysis suggests that even with Model B, people are not using the below the line option to express their intra-party preferences. In other words, the PR aspect is dominating the STV aspect. Now, whether you think that's a problem or not really depends on whether you think people's preferences, what are they trying to express? Do they want to express inter-party or intra-party? Because trying to do both of them ends up with this fairly complicated system that we currently have now. But we do need some more data to look at what's happening in Model B systems, and we'd love to talk to some electoral commissions and maybe get a sample of ballots for South Australia or New South Wales, for example, to see what people are doing when they vote below the line. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
John, look, thank you for that. Very informative. John, I might just quickly jump to Martin, whether Martin wanted to add anything to that fine presentation from yourself. Martin, is there anything you wish to add?
No, I think John's covered it pretty well, and I'm sure that there might be a few questions, and we're happy to take those.
Okay, well, look, I'll look forward to some questions coming forward. John, I just would observe, you made the comment there in Victoria, where below the line voting in 2018 went up to nearly 9%. Of course, as an administrator, that of itself is a concern because I've got the logistics around that where I have to data enter every ballot paper. And if we get into the position where I've got to do a recount in a region in a very short time frame, it's logistically very demanding on people. But that's just from the administration perspective.
It's an important point. It's an important point. Certainly, that was raised with us in our committee as well. People were talking about, well, there's what should happen. There's also what's practical, and can you vote? Can you count the vote in a sufficiently short period of time, etc.
And of course, the AEC with the Senate do ballot paper scanning as well, which is of itself is a huge logistics task.
Yeah.
Now I'm going into questions. I'm not sure, Rachel, if you identify those or bring them forward to me at all, but I can't see any at the moment.
Can't see any questions either.
What is it? We wait the 7 seconds. Is that the is that the academic way, John?
Oh, we've got one. When do you think Australia will move to full electronic voting?
Now, look, do you want me as a moderator to offer a view on that? I know Damon mentioned it in relation to New South Wales and iVote. Look, I think it is some way off. The New South Wales iVote experience probably hasn't helped. I myself, as an administrator, do like the tangible ballot paper, which I can count and recount any number of times, and I have it available to me, and also to scrutineers as well. Technology remains a challenge, and I don't see it occurring, certainly in the Victorian context, for some time. Other jurisdictions may take a different view on that. Technology, expense, parliaments have to be accepting of it, and parties as well, and the community also. We keep getting asked that question. I don't see it being introduced in the near future, certainly in Victoria and potentially other jurisdictions. That's my view only. I don't know whether John or Martin or Damon have a view on that.
Sorry, I might just jump in quickly. I think Warwick's answer is really important because the first part is the Commission's part and the actual doing part, which is huge. But the other issue that gets raised from time to time is integrity. Now, I know banks have all your details and do all electronic transactions and can reverse them, but an election is a decision of a collective population at a very specific point in time. So if you had any problems with integrity, would you be comfortable rerunning an entire election or something of that ilk? And that would be a bit catastrophic from election management bodies, I'd imagine. That's just another argument that gets thrown in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to think about electronic voting too is that there's remote internet voting and there's electronic voting at the polling place. And in the ACT, when we vote in territory elections, when we early vote, there are machines at the polling place where you can lodge a vote electronically. And in fact, they were much used during the most recent election, which was during the COVID era. But people like my colleague, sometimes colleague, Michael Maley has very strong views on electronic voting, and IT security experts, people like Dr. Vanessa Teague is very outspoken on her view that, mathematically you can't actually, make a secure system. There are also issues with similar issues to postal voting, like can you prevent someone voter impersonation or vote buying, those sorts of things. How can you be ensured that a person casting a vote isn't being intimidated by a family member, for example, and made to cast a certain vote? So, I mean, I think in Australia, attendance voting, as Tom Rogers said, is what we do. It's what the system's built around. I think there'll be a real sort of reluctance amongst legislatures and administrators to sort of move away from that in any large degree. But as the New South Wales local government election's shown, lots of voters want to, vote at home in their pajamas, despite what the legislatures might think, and at some point the weight of public opinion might drag them in that direction.
Thanks, Damon, for that. John and Martin, can you see the next two questions there?
I can. I think I'll let Martin answer the first one from Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Martin.
Yeah, look, I think that the issues that you raised, Stephen, there's two interrelated issues. One is antipathy towards the parties. Another one is antipathy towards individual candidate selection. So some people are happy to vote for a party, but unhappy with the candidate selection. I'd say that's the smaller group. At least that's what our early data seems to indicate. And then there's a bigger group that just don't like the party. So if you don't like the party, you'll vote for minor parties and other groups. And that's obviously happening in much larger numbers nationally. I might just speak really briefly to Michael's question as well, then John can offer a view, because we'd had to consider this as part of the Ministerial Expert Committee in Western Australia. And the model there does allow for candidates to be elected on 2 to 3% of the vote. But keep in mind, there will be 37 members elected in that system. So if you get 1/37th of the vote, there's an argument that you've got every right to be elected as much as a major party candidate has, because you've got as much of the vote as each of their individual candidates have. So I think the answer is perhaps yes, provided you're not given an unfair advantage through an electoral system. But another view.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I mean, I think there is a world of difference between minor parties and micro parties. I mean, minor parties have to get the vote themselves. And I think that was the sentiment we got from the submissions to our committee and from the general sentiment where people said, well, come on, you can't get elected with 0.02% of the vote. If you get 2.4%, well, then you've actually got some people, you've got members, you've got people actually voting for you, as opposed to you've done a good preference deal above the line. So that's the real issue there, getting rid of the preference whisperers, and it comes down then to actual preferences. Martin, you might just also talk about this party bosses issue. It doesn't happen very often in Australia, but you do occasionally get campaigns where people are dropped down the ticket and there's a big battle within the party, and maybe an unpopular or controversial person gets put on number 3 or 4 on the unwinnable ticket spot. And then they ask and do a bit of a call out to people who will vote for me first. And there's a couple of examples of that in Australia, isn't there? Not very many, but a couple.
Yeah, I think people here from Tasmania will be very familiar with Lisa Singh's campaign, which was successful in getting elected below the line. Of course, that occurred in a Hare-Clark system where there's a normative aspect there. Voters are used to voting below the line. They're comfortable with doing so. Jim Molan got a huge number of votes below the line in New South Wales, more votes than all of the candidates in many of the party tickets in Tasmania, but still didn't get elected. So it's much harder in New South Wales where it's not a normative thing, but also the size of the Senate there, the size of the votes, the number of votes you need to win is massive. So I think it really does depend on your jurisdiction and what voters are used to doing. But clearly there's a tactic there in the right place and the right time.
If I could just add also, I mean, one of the issues is also nominators for candidates. And one of the arguments I think Anthony Green has made sort of quite a few times in relation to particularly the federal Senate is that there's no requirement for nominators for candidates. So a party can nominate, once you've registered as a party, you can nominate candidates all over Australia, despite where they might live. That has some impact. And I mean, I have fairly strong views on this because I was at the AEC during the 2013 election where we had the likes of the Australian Motor Enthusiast Party elected off group voting tickets, and I was at the Parliamentary Library in 2016 and advising the Parliament on the changes to the Electoral Act when they changed the Senate voting system. And I've had numerous, and I note in your presentation you say, well, why not move to just a list system? And that's definitely one of the arguments you hear, and or why not remove the above the line option? And living in the ACT and having experience of Hare-Clark, I quite like Hare-Clark voting, but again, Anthony argues that the party, the Senate vote is a party vote in Australia, essentially, despite the fact that us electoral purists might think STV is a candidate-based system. Essentially, what we've got is a party-based system that has been stapled on top of a candidate-based system, and the reality is most voters are not voting for candidates, they're voting for parties, with the exceptions of, for example, Lisa Singh's campaign.
And I think it's no accident that in the two smaller jurisdictions, Tasmania and ACT, where the Hare-Clark voting for an individual sort of comes to the fore, because it's easy to be known, get around and get a personal vote at an upper house level. Whereas if you ask most people in Western Australia and above, and in more populous states, who their upper house member is, they don't really actually know because they're voting for the party. So I think, I think Australia's got a reasonably good balance now. It's complicated below the line, and it's almost a tail wagging the dog type situation in ballot design and working out the rules to make sure the below the line system works fairly for all and is still efficient, when in fact somewhere between 91 and 98% of the action is actually happening above the line. So it does make it complicated, I'm sure, for electoral commissions like Warwick's.
Look, thanks, John. I notice we're right on time and there are no further questions. What I'd like to do is to thank Damon, John and Martin for not only their presentations, but also their responses to the questions that have come forward. I would just like to inform the group, of course, that the next session will be at 1 o'clock. So we now go to a lunch break. And Rachel, I'll just defer to you. Is there anything else that I need to do at this point to bring session 6 to a close?
Nope, you're all good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.
Thanks indeed.
Bye.